On a brisk autumn evening in the heart of New Orleans, where the soft hum of jazz from the local bars melded with the distant rustle of the Mississippi River, the streets pulsed with life. Tourists wandered, entranced by the rhythmic beat of the city, their feet tapping on cobblestones worn smooth by years of celebrations and heartbreak. French Quarter was alive, electric with revelers clad in beads, masks, and feathers, their laughter spilling into the night air like a symphony of carefree abandon. Amongst the revelry, there was a young woman named Lila, who had just finished her shift at a small boutique that catered to the artsy, bohemian crowd of the neighborhood. Lila was striking, with dark curls that cascaded like a river over her shoulders and eyes that reflected an unwavering resolve. She walked the streets often, always at ease in her neighborhood. But tonight, as she closed up shop and slung her worn leather satchel over her shoulder, a shiver of apprehension slid down her spine. Have you ever felt that chill down your spine when something just didn't seem right? The city seemed darker, less inviting, and the usual clamor of laughter and jazz sounded far away, muffled by the sense of something lurking. At her side trotted Tyler, her loyal German shepherd. Tyler was not just a pet. He was her guardian, her friend, a presence as steady as the current of the river. With his coal-black coat glistening under the glow of gas lamps and his amber eyes alert, he was a formidable protector. Lila had found him abandoned as a pup on a stormy night, and since that day, their bond had been forged in the fires of loyalty and love. As Lila wound through the narrow alleys, the echoes of footsteps behind her quickened her pulse. What would you do if you found yourself in a situation where every step could be your last? It wasn't unusual to hear people walking behind her, especially in this lively part of town, but tonight, there was something different in their cadence, an erratic, heavy thump that seemed to carry a hint of malice. She glanced back, her eyes catching the shapes of 5 men. They staggered and laughed raucously, bottles clinking and voices slurred with intoxication. The sour tang of alcohol seemed to reach her nostrils even from a distance. They were moving faster now, their laughter twisted into something sharp, like glass shattering. "Hey, sweetheart, where you going so fast?" one of them shouted, his voice cutting through the warm, humid air like a blade. The others erupted in a chorus of crude jeers and whistles. Their steps grew more deliberate, more targeted. The hair on Tyler's neck bristled, and a low growl rumbled from deep within his chest. He sensed the danger before Lila fully registered it. She quickened her pace, trying to keep her breathing steady, to keep her hands from shaking. Every step she took seemed to echo louder, reverberating off the walls that hemmed her in on either side. She knew this neighborhood like the back of her hand, the twists and turns of each street, where the pavement dipped or cracked, but tonight, it felt like a labyrinth with no exit. Panic coiled tight in her chest as the sound of the men's pursuit grew louder, their words sharper, more menacing. "Come on, don't be so shy," another one called, his voice grating with mock affection. A bottle smashed behind her, splintering into a dozen pieces, and she flinched. The street she was on was quieter now, cut off from the main thoroughfare where the revelers roamed. The distant strains of music and laughter felt like a cruel reminder that help was too far away. Lila's hand instinctively found Tyler's fur, clinging to the comfort it offered. His growl intensified, a warning that seemed to pulse in the air. He moved in front of her, placing his body between Lila and the approaching men, who were now close enough that she could make out their sneers, the way their eyes glistened with reckless confidence. The leader of the group, a burly man with a scruffy beard and a cigarette tucked behind his ear, stepped forward. He looked at Tyler and smirked. "A dog? Really? You think that's gonna scare us?" He flicked his hand dismissively, as if swatting away an annoying fly. Tyler's eyes locked on the man, unblinking, as if he were measuring him, assessing the threat. He shifted his weight, muscles taut, waiting for a command that Lila didn't even need to say aloud. Every fiber of his being was attuned to her, to the slight tremor in her voice, the way her heart raced under her skin. Time seemed to suspend in the charged silence that followed, each second stretching out like an eternity. Lila knew she had to make a decision, to run and hope that someone might hear her, or to stand her ground, protected only by the four-legged companion who had never let her down. But the men were close now, their steps closing the gap as if with a predator's precision. Tyler's growl deepened, vibrating with an intensity that silenced even the reckless bravado of the drunken men, if only for a heartbeat. As the men closed in, their laughter turned guttural, a sound that curdled the air around them. Lila could taste the metallic tang of fear on her tongue. The street seemed to narrow, the shadows pressing in until all that remained were the cold stares of those who sought to harm her. One of the men, thin and wiry with hollow cheeks and a tattoo of a snake winding around his neck, took a step forward, leering at her with eyes that glittered with cruel intent. "Didn't anyone tell you, darling?" he said, his voice oozing with mock concern. "It's dangerous to be out alone at night." Lila didn't respond. Her heart hammered so loudly she wondered if they could hear it, a wild drumbeat of panic. She glanced around, hoping to spot someone, anyone, who could intervene. But the street was deserted, the nearest signs of life just faint smudges of noise from the busy boulevard blocks away. Tyler shifted his stance, muscles coiled like springs, ready to launch at a moment's notice. His growl, deep and unyielding, cut through the night air, silencing the men for a second. The leader, burly with a crooked nose that had been broken more than once, smirked and nodded to the wiry man beside him. "Get her," he said, his voice low and filled with the kind of menace that made Lila's stomach twist. Before she could react, the wiry man lunged forward, his hands outstretched. But Tyler was faster. With a snarl that seemed to shake the very walls of the narrow street, he leaped, sinking his teeth into the man's forearm. Sometimes, bravery comes from where we least expect it. Would you believe that a four-legged friend could be your hero? The man's scream echoed down the alley, piercing and desperate. He thrashed, trying to dislodge Tyler, but the dog held firm, his eyes fierce and unrelenting. The sudden attack jolted the other men out of their drunken haze. They hesitated, eyes wide, watching as their friend crumpled to the ground with Tyler latched onto him. Blood seeped through the fabric of his sleeve, dark and spreading like ink. The leader's eyes narrowed with rage, and he reached for something inside his coat, a glint of metal, small but unmistakable. Lila's breath caught in her throat. A knife! "Get the damn dog off him!" one of the other men shouted, his voice high with panic. He lunged at Tyler, fist swinging, but Tyler anticipated the move. He released the first man just as the other approached, pivoting on powerful legs and snapping at the second man's outstretched hand. The man recoiled, stumbling backward and cursing. "Lila, run!" a voice screamed inside her head, but she couldn't move. Her legs felt rooted to the spot as if they had fused with the pavement beneath her feet. It was as if the world had shrunk down to this alley, these men and Tyler, who stood between her and the darkness threatening to swallow her whole. The leader with the knife took a step forward, eyes locked on Tyler. His smirk had turned into a snarl, lips pulled back to reveal yellowed teeth. He lunged, knife slicing through the air in a sharp arc. Lila gasped, the sound raw and terrified. But Tyler moved like lightning, ducking under the blade and snapping his jaws around the man's wrist. The knife clattered to the ground, spinning away into the darkness. The leader screamed, his bravado shattered in an instant. He fell to his knees, cradling his arm as blood trickled between his fingers. The other men exchanged glances, fear now plain in their eyes. One of them took a step back, then another, until he turned and bolted down the street. The remaining two looked torn between loyalty and self-preservation, their expressions flickering between shock and horror. "Forget it! Let's go!" one of them shouted, already retreating, his eyes darting between Tyler and his fallen friends. The second man hesitated for just a moment longer before turning and running, the sound of their footfalls fading into the distance. Only the leader remained, gasping and crumpled on the ground with his injured arm. His eyes, wide and wild, met Lila's. For the first time, she saw something other than arrogance in them, fear. The kind that seeps deep, like ice melting into veins. Tyler stood over him, teeth bared, his growl a warning that resonated in the hollow space of the alley. The man tried to scramble backward, but his strength faltered. Tyler stepped forward, each movement deliberate, his eyes never wavering from the man's. The leader trembled, the fight gone from him as he collapsed fully, his back hitting the damp bricks of the wall behind him. He raised his uninjured arm in a silent plea for mercy. "Please, call him off," he panted, eyes flickering to Lila with desperation. The power had shifted, the hunter had become the hunted. Lila finally found her voice, though it wavered. "Tyler, heel." At her command, Tyler hesitated, the growl tapering off but not disappearing entirely. He retreated, eyes still fixed on the man, as if making it known that any sudden movement would be met with the full force of his wrath. The man exhaled shakily, clutching his bleeding arm as he slumped in defeat. Silence blanketed the alley, broken only by the distant murmur of the city that had continued, blissfully unaware of what had transpired. Lila's knees buckled, and she sank to the ground, one hand finding Tyler's fur. He pressed his warm body against her side, anchoring her in the moment, as if to say, "It's over. I'm here." Tears welled in her eyes, the weight of the terror crashing down on her now that the immediate danger had passed. She buried her face in Tyler's neck, his fur damp with sweat and adrenaline, and let herself cry. For the first time that night, the sound that left her wasn't one of fear, but of relief. The echo of the men's retreating footsteps faded into the night, leaving only the soft murmur of the distant city and the sound of Tyler's steady, protective panting. Lila knelt on the cold, damp ground, her limbs trembling with adrenaline that refused to release its grip. The metallic tang of fear was still on her tongue, the remnants of raw panic throbbing just beneath her skin. The leader of the group lay slumped against the brick wall, his bravado extinguished and replaced by an expression Lila couldn't quite read. Pain, yes, but also something more profound. His breath came in ragged gasps, each one hitching as he cradled his injured arm, the blood seeping through his fingers. The street lamp overhead cast a wan glow that sharpened the lines of his face, revealing him for what he truly was, not an untouchable monster, but a desperate man who had pushed too far and paid the price. Lila struggled to her feet, her muscles aching and stiff as if they were waking from a long paralysis. She glanced at Tyler, who stood vigilant at her side, his eyes still locked on the fallen man as if daring him to make a move. She wanted to scream, to yell at the man for the terror he had brought into her night, into her life. But she found that her voice was trapped, tangled in the jumble of relief, fear, and something else, pity, that she didn't want to acknowledge. "Please. I need help," the man whispered, his voice stripped of all the bravado it once held. His eyes flickered to Lila, pleading. Lila's instincts screamed at her to walk away, to leave him in the darkness he had carved out for himself. Being brave isn't just about facing danger, it's about knowing when to show humanity. What would you do having the age you have now? Yet something kept her rooted to the spot. Maybe it was the way his chest heaved with each painful breath, or the way the street, now emptied of menace, seemed suddenly too quiet, as if holding its breath to see what she would do. Tyler's gaze shifted to her, his ears perked up, as if he were reading her mind and waiting for her decision. She reached out a trembling hand and rested it on his head, feeling the warmth of his fur beneath her fingertips. The gesture steadied her, reminding her of all the moments they'd shared, the nights he'd been her silent companion when the weight of the world seemed too much to bear. "Why should I help you?" Lila asked, her voice cracking but holding firm. The man winced, the question cutting deeper than she had expected. I was just drunk." "It was a mistake," he muttered, though his words lacked conviction. He looked down at the blood on his arm, then at Tyler, whose eyes glistened like embers in the night. "Please. I'm sorry." Lila's fingers clenched tighter in Tyler's fur. She knew it was dangerous to believe him, to give credence to any excuse he might offer. But as she looked at him, hunched and broken, she couldn't deny the humanity that lingered, flickering like a flame ready to be snuffed out. "Stay there," she finally said, her voice stronger now. She took a few steps backward, pulling out her phone with shaking fingers. Her instinct was to call the police, to let them handle what remained of this nightmarish encounter. But then she thought about Tyler, his fierce loyalty, and how he had defended her without hesitation. This wasn't just about justice or vengeance, it was about acknowledging what it meant to stand up, not just for herself, but for what was right, no matter how hard. The 911 operator answered, her voice cool and professional. Lila explained what had happened, her voice steadying with each word. As she spoke, she glanced down at the man, who seemed to deflate even more at the realization that help was coming, but not just for him, for her too. Within minutes, the distant wail of sirens pierced the night. The leader's eyes darted around, the last vestiges of his defiance crumbling as red and blue lights splashed across the brick walls. When the police arrived, they assessed the situation quickly. Officers moved in, their questions brisk and precise. Tyler remained by Lila's side, his body relaxed but his eyes still watchful. The officers approached her, taking in her disheveled state, the way her fingers tangled in the fur of the dog who had stood as her shield. They listened as she told them everything, their eyes flicking from her to Tyler, the dog who had held the line when hope seemed thin. The paramedics tended to the man, who now looked more defeated than dangerous. One officer, tall with a kind expression, turned to Lila and nodded toward Tyler. "Looks like you had an angel watching over you tonight," he said, a small smile softening the hard lines of his face. Lila glanced down at Tyler, her eyes stinging with tears that had nothing to do with fear this time. She nodded. "Yes, I did." The men who had fled were still at large, but the officers assured her they would search for them. For now, though, the street was safe again. The city's hum felt less menacing, its lights more like guardians than shadows. As the officers led the injured man to the waiting ambulance, he cast one last look at Lila. This time, there was no mockery in his eyes, no laughter or challenge, only a hollow sort of gratitude that she had chosen to act with humanity when she could have turned her back. Lila and Tyler watched as the ambulance drove away, the wail of its siren merging with the heartbeat of New Orleans. The adrenaline slowly seeped from her veins, leaving only exhaustion and a sense of fragile victory. She knelt beside Tyler, burying her face in his fur, breathing in his warmth and the scent of safety. "You saved me, Tyler," she whispered, her voice breaking, not from fear this time but from an overwhelming gratitude. Tyler nuzzled her gently, a soft whine escaping his throat, as if to say, "Of course. Always." In the days that followed, the events of that night replayed in Lila's mind in flashes, vivid and unrelenting. Every time she closed her eyes, she could hear the mocking laughter of the men, feel the cold, predatory gaze of their leader, and sense the electric crackle of fear that had coursed through her veins. But through it all, there was Tyler, a steady, unyielding beacon. Each time the memories threatened to overwhelm her, she would reach down, fingers finding the familiar texture of his fur, and the panic would recede. The police had followed up with her a few times, taking detailed statements and keeping her informed on the investigation. They managed to catch 2 of the men who had run, while the others remained at large. The leader, whose name she learned was Sean Peterson, was facing charges for attempted assault. The officers had assured her that his injuries, courtesy of Tyler's fierce protection, would keep him from trying anything for a while. The weight of those words brought her little comfort. It was Tyler's unwavering presence that eased her fears, day after day. The story of the night Lila was almost attacked spread quickly through her neighborhood. It wasn't long before friends, neighbors, and even strangers would stop her on the street to thank her for being brave, to praise Tyler for being the hero they all needed. The boutique where she worked put up a sign that read, "Protected by Tyler the Hero Dog," and soon, patrons were coming in just to meet him. One afternoon, about a week after the incident, Lila was sitting on the worn-out bench in Jackson Square, the oak trees casting dappled shadows across the ground. Tyler sat by her feet, alert but relaxed, his ears flicking every time a street musician struck a particularly loud chord on their guitar. The square was alive with its usual array of tourists, artists, and performers, all basking in the sun and the unique pulse of New Orleans. A man approached hesitantly. He was older, with silver hair that caught the light and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. He wore a park ranger's uniform, the green fabric neat and crisp. He paused a few feet away, waiting for Lila's nod before coming closer. "I'm sorry to bother you, miss," he began, his voice gentle, "but I heard about what happened last week. Is this the famous Tyler?" He smiled at the dog, who tilted his head slightly, ears perking up as if acknowledging the attention. Lila smiled softly and nodded. "Yes, this is Tyler," she said, patting his head. Tyler's tail thumped once against the wooden slats of the bench. "I'm Arthur Reynolds," the man introduced himself. "I work at the Wildlife Rescue Center just outside the city. I wanted to come by and thank you both in person. We need more stories like yours, ones that remind people of the loyalty and courage animals are capable of." His eyes softened as he looked at Tyler, who leaned into Lila's touch. "We'd love to host you both at the center sometime. Maybe you could share your story with some of our volunteers and visitors." Lila's chest tightened with emotion. The past week had been a blur of fear and recovery, but this moment felt different. It felt like the beginning of something new, a shift from being a victim to being a symbol of resilience. She nodded, a small smile breaking across her face. "We'd love that, Mr. Reynolds." As the ranger walked away, Lila sat back and looked at Tyler, whose amber eyes met hers, filled with the same quiet strength that had saved her that night. The breeze whispered through the trees, rustling the Spanish moss that hung like lace from the branches, and for the first time since that terrifying night, Lila felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The visit to the Wildlife Rescue Center came 2 weeks later. The sun was high, casting golden beams across the sprawling sanctuary that was filled with the sounds of chirping birds and the rustling of leaves. Volunteers moved about, feeding rescued animals, cleaning enclosures, and guiding visitors. Lila and Tyler were greeted warmly, smiles and nods of recognition following them as they were led to a shaded area where chairs were set up for a small group. Arthur stood at the front, beaming as Lila took a seat, Tyler sitting dutifully by her side. "Everyone," Arthur began, his voice carrying over the soft murmur of the crowd, "we have a special guest today. This is Lila, and this brave soul beside her is Tyler. A true hero who protected his person in a way that only the most loyal hearts can." Applause filled the air, followed by a chorus of awed whispers. Tyler's ears flicked at the sound, and he turned his head slightly, as if taking it all in. Lila felt a surge of pride swell in her chest. When the applause died down, she shared her story, not just the fear and danger, but also the bond that had carried her through it. When she finished, there was a brief, reverent silence before an elderly woman in the front row spoke, her voice thick with emotion. It's a reminder that sometimes the greatest protectors don't wear uniforms or badges. They come on 4 legs, with eyes that look straight into your soul. Lila's eyes stung as she reached down to scratch behind Tyler's ears. He responded with a soft sigh and leaned into her touch, as if to say, "I'm just doing my job." The visit to the center marked a turning point. Lila began volunteering there on weekends, sharing Tyler's story and working with rescued animals that had faced their own battles. She met dogs that had been abandoned, owls with broken wings, raccoons too young to survive on their own. Each creature carried scars, visible and invisible, but there was a shared resilience among them, a silent understanding that survival was not just about enduring, but about finding the strength to trust again. And with each weekend, as Lila watched Tyler playfully interact with animals and people alike, she found her own strength returning. The nightmares that had haunted her sleep began to fade, replaced by dreams filled with hope and the warm, unwavering presence of her best friend by her side. As the months rolled by, the memory of that fateful night became a part of Lila's story rather than the defining chapter. She learned to walk the streets of New Orleans again with her head held high, no longer flinching at the sound of footsteps behind her. And always, there was Tyler, his tail wagging, his eyes keen and full of unspoken promises. He had been her guardian angel, not just in the darkest moment, but in the quiet hours that followed, in the healing days when fear still clung to her like a shadow. The community never forgot Tyler's bravery. Local papers ran stories about Tyler the hero dog, and children in the neighborhood would stop to pet him, their eyes wide with admiration. Lila would smile, pride radiating from her as she watched Tyler bask in the attention, ever patient, ever gentle. The incident had forged something stronger than fear. It had created an unbreakable bond between Lila, Tyler, and their city. One evening, after a long day of volunteering at the Wildlife Rescue Center, Lila sat on her porch with Tyler lying at her feet. The sun set behind them, casting the sky in deep purples and golds. She sipped her tea, feeling content, a feeling she once thought impossible after that night. Tyler glanced up at her, his eyes catching the light, and she reached down to ruffle his fur. "Thank you," she whispered. It was a simple phrase, but Tyler's ears twitched, and he leaned into her touch, as if to say, "Always." The lessons from that night stayed with her. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the determination to face it. And sometimes, the greatest heroes come in the most unexpected forms, ready to protect those they love without hesitation, no matter the odds. Tyler had shown her that bravery is born not just in a single moment, but in every small act of love and loyalty that follows. And in that knowledge, Lila found peace. And if you, too, want peace and understand how to never face this stage of life alone, stay connected. I've left instructions in the pinned comment to guide you to something that can bring the support and companionship needed in these crucial times. If you enjoy this kind of heartfelt and inspiring content, there's another channel I'll link on the end screen. It's run with just as much love and dedication as I put into these stories, and I highly recommend checking it out.